The people driving into Hurricane Helena that night were never supposed to come back. The first emergency alert hit phones across the Gulf Coast at 7:14 p.m. By midnight, every gas station from Biloxi to Bayhaven had lines stretching into the highway. Families stuffed clothes into trash bags. Pickup trucks pulled campers through sheets of rain. Police cruisers screamed through flooded intersections, while local news anchors warned that Helena had strengthened into a Category 5 storm faster than anyone predicted. Meteorologists called it a once-in-a-generation disaster, the kind people talk about for the rest of their lives. By 2 in the morning, the winds sounded like freight trains tearing through the sky. Windows exploded across the shoreline. Palm trees bent until they snapped in half. Entire blocks disappeared under black water before sunrise. And somewhere in the middle of that chaos, while thousands of people were trying to escape the coast, a convoy of old pickup trucks was driving straight toward the storm. They weren't firefighters. They weren't National Guard soldiers. None of them wore uniforms. They were ordinary people. A retired Marine named Mason Pike, who usually spent his evenings drinking beer outside a seafood diner near the marina. Claire Dawson, a 26-year-old nurse who worked double shifts at Bayhaven Medical Center and still stopped every Thursday night to bring leftover coffee to homeless veterans sleeping near the bus station. Eleanor Price, a 72-year-old widow who baked bread every Friday for the free community kitchen hidden behind an old church downtown. Tyler Quinn, a skinny 20-year-old live streamer who used to sleep near the harbor before somebody gave him a second chance at life. And leading all of them was Ryan Mercer, the owner of a small auto garage on Harbor Street that smelled like motor oil, rust, and fresh coffee every morning at 6. Ryan wasn't rich. He wasn't famous. But if your transmission failed and you couldn't pay, Ryan fixed it anyway. If your heater broke during winter, he found spare parts somewhere. If somebody got laid off and couldn't afford groceries, somehow an envelope of cash showed up in their mailbox. So when Hurricane Helena made landfall and television stations started showing families trapped inside flooded homes, Ryan unlocked his garage in the middle of the night and made one phone call after another. Get to the shop, he told them. Bring whatever you can carry. By 3:30 in the morning, headlights cut through the rain outside Mercer Automotive. One truck arrived carrying propane tanks. Another brought blankets and canned food. Mason backed in an old fishing trailer with a rescue boat strapped to it using faded orange rope. Eleanor showed up, soaked to the bone, carrying dozens of warm loaves wrapped in kitchen towels. Tyler mounted portable floodlights to the roof of his truck while live streaming to the few viewers still awake across the country. I don't know what we're driving into, he told the camera quietly, rainwater running down his face. But somebody out there needs help. Ryan stood in the middle of the garage while thunder rattled the walls hard enough to shake loose dust from the ceiling beams. Around him, ordinary people loaded fuel cans, medicine kits, bottled water, flashlights, diapers, batteries, dog food, and dry clothes into truck beds already slick with rain. Nobody asked how dangerous it would be. Nobody asked if the roads were still open. Outside, the storm sirens kept screaming across Bayhaven like something alive. Ryan zipped up his weather jacket and stared toward the flooded highway disappearing into darkness beyond the garage doors. Somewhere out there, entire neighborhoods were already underwater. Somewhere, children were trapped in attics while parents prayed the water would stop rising. Somewhere, people were waiting for help that might never come. Ryan took a slow breath and looked back at the convoy gathering behind him. Listen to me, he said, his voice almost swallowed by the storm. No one gets left behind tonight. Then the garage doors rolled open, and the convoy disappeared into the rain. The farther the convoy drove into Bayhaven County, the quieter the roads became. At first there were still signs of evacuation. Minivans packed with mattresses and bicycles crawled through flooded intersections while families stared through fogged windows with exhausted eyes. Gas stations stood dark beside the highway, their pumps already swallowed by rising water. Rain hammered against the trucks so hard it sounded like gravel hitting metal. Every few miles, another power transformer exploded somewhere in the distance, lighting up the clouds blue for half a second before darkness swallowed everything again. Tyler kept his live stream running from the passenger seat of Ryan's truck, even though the signal cut in and out every few minutes. Thousands of comments flooded the screen whenever the connection returned. Some people begged them to turn around. Others posted addresses of trapped relatives. One message appeared over and over again from different accounts. Please help my parents on Magnolia Street. Ryan gripped the steering wheel tighter each time he read another message flashing across Tyler's phone. Water already covered most of the roads leading into town. In some places, the flood reached halfway up the truck tires, forcing them to move slowly through currents strong enough to push debris straight across the highway. Claire sat in the back seat, organizing medicine supplies under the weak glow of a flashlight, while trying to ignore the emergency calls still coming through her hospital pager. Bayhaven Medical Center had lost backup generators an hour ago. Patients were being transferred by flashlight through flooded hallways. Somewhere behind them, the hospital where Claire had worked nearly every day for the last 4 years was slowly drowning. But she never said a word about turning back. As they crossed into the downtown district, the real destruction began to appear. Storefront windows were gone. Fishing boats floated sideways through parking lots. Entire traffic lights leaned underwater with only the tops still visible above the flood. Mason drove ahead, pulling the rescue boat, while muttering quietly under his breath every time another tree blocked part of the road. I have lived through hurricanes before, he finally said through the radio crackling between trucks. But I have never seen water rise this fast. Ryan did not answer. He was staring. At the second floor of a motel, where several people stood waving flashlights through broken windows. The convoy stopped immediately. Within seconds, everyone jumped into motion. Mason and Ryan lowered the rescue boat into waist-deep floodwater, while Claire pulled blankets and dry clothes from the truck beds. Eleanor handed out plastic bags filled with bread she had baked only hours earlier, while whispering prayers under the storm roaring around them. Tyler climbed onto the hood of a truck, pointing his camera toward the stranded families. We found survivors near Harbor Avenue, he told the live stream, his voice shaking slightly from cold and adrenaline. If rescue teams are monitoring this feed, there are at least 12 people trapped here. One by one, they ferried families from the motel to a nearby elementary school sitting on slightly higher ground. The school gymnasium had already become an emergency shelter filled with frightened families wrapped in wet blankets. Toddlers cried softly beside folding chairs. Elderly couples stared silently at battery-powered radios, searching for updates that never came. A little boy wearing a soaked Spider-Man sweatshirt held tightly onto a golden retriever almost his own size, while his mother tried to calm him down. Claire moved through the shelter, checking temperatures and blood pressure with supplies balanced in her arms, while Eleanor passed out warm bread, still carrying the smell of butter and flour. For a few minutes, the gym almost felt human again. Then the lights failed completely. The entire building dropped into darkness except for flashlights and the occasional flash of lightning outside. Somewhere deep in the shelter, somebody started crying. The wind outside screamed louder than before, rattling the windows hard enough to make several people flinch at once. Tyler looked down at his phone and swallowed hard. Ryan, he said quietly. The levee near Magnolia Street just collapsed. Nobody spoke for a moment. Magnolia Street sat in the lowest part of Bayhaven. Hundreds of homes were there. Ryan slowly turned toward the flooded streets beyond the school entrance where rainwater kept rising inch by inch against the doors. Then another emergency message appeared on Tyler's screen. A woman trapped in an attic had sent her location before her phone battery died. Ryan grabbed his flashlight and rain jacket without hesitation. We are not done yet, he said. Then he stepped back into the storm. The rain felt colder after midnight. Not because the temperature had dropped, but because exhaustion was beginning to settle into everyone's bones. Ryan could see it in the way Mason climbed slower into the rescue boat. He could hear it in Claire's breathing every time she carried another medical bag through waist-deep water. Even Tyler's voice had changed. The nervous energy that filled his live stream hours earlier was gone now, replaced by something quieter and heavier. Bayhaven no longer looked like a town. It looked like the ocean had swallowed an entire world and left only rooftops behind. Street signs barely poked above the water. Cars drifted silently between houses like abandoned toys. Every few blocks, another home groaned under pressure from the flood before disappearing into darkness. The convoy moved carefully through neighborhoods where the current had become strong enough to pull tree branches, garbage cans, and broken fences down entire streets. Ryan steered the rescue boat using only a flashlight and memory because most landmarks were already underwater. Somewhere nearby, a dog barked nonstop into the storm. Somewhere else a woman screamed for help before the wind swallowed the sound completely. Magnolia Street was worse than anyone imagined. The levee collapse had turned the entire neighborhood into a river. Water rushed between homes with enough force to shake porches loose from foundations. Some houses were already flooded to the roofline. Others leaned sideways under the current. Ryan spotted movement near the second floor of a blue house, almost hidden behind drifting debris. An elderly man was waving weakly from a tiny attic window while clutching a golden Labrador against his chest. "Over there," Claire shouted through the rain. Mason pushed the boat closer while Ryan climbed onto the submerged porch railing and forced open the attic hatch from outside. The old man inside was trembling so badly he could barely stand. Water had already reached the lower half of the attic ladder. The dog pressed tightly against him, shaking from cold and fear. "I could not leave him," the man whispered as Ryan helped him into the boat. "Jacob is all I have left." Ryan wrapped a blanket around both of them without saying a word. Jacob rested his head against the old man's shoulder as if he understood everything happening around him. Tyler filmed quietly from the back of the boat, but for the first time all night, he stopped speaking to the camera. Some moments felt too personal for narration. As they moved deeper into the neighborhood, the floodwaters became darker and more dangerous. Entire power lines floated just beneath the surface. Mason kept warning everyone not to touch the water unless absolutely necessary. Every few minutes, another emergency alert echoed from abandoned phones somewhere inside flooded homes. Claire suddenly raised her flashlight toward a rooftop 50 yards away. A young woman sat there in the rain holding a child tightly against her chest. Ryan could hear the little girl coughing even above the storm. The mother looked exhausted beyond words. Her wet hair stuck to her face while she tried to shield the child from wind using only her own body. "Please," she cried when she saw the rescue boat. "Please help my daughter." The little girl looked no older than 6. Her lips trembled from cold and fever while she buried her face against her mother's shoulder. Ryan guided the boat close enough for Claire to climb onto the roof beside them. "What is her name?" Claire asked softly while checking the child's temperature with shaking hands. "Emma," the mother answered. "Her name is Emma." The little girl slowly looked up at Ryan through rainwater dripping down her face. "Are we going to die out here?" she whispered. For a second, nobody spoke. The storm roared around them so loudly it almost sounded alive. Ryan reached forward and pulled his jacket tighter around her small shoulders. "Not tonight, sweetheart," he said quietly. Claire helped Sophie and Emma into the rescue boat, while Mason scanned the flooded street ahead with growing concern. The current was getting stronger every minute. Somewhere nearby, metal twisted loudly against concrete. Then a deep cracking sound echoed through the darkness beyond Magnolia Street. Everyone froze. Tyler pointed his flashlight toward the distance where the highway bridge connected Bayhaven to the mainland. One entire section had begun collapsing into the floodwater below. The sound of the bridge collapsing echoed across Bayhaven like thunder rolling through the middle of the ocean. For several long seconds, nobody inside the rescue boat moved. They simply stared into the darkness where the highway once connected the town to the outside world. Then the final section disappeared beneath the floodwater with a deep metallic groan, and Tyler lowered his camera slowly without saying a word. The mainland was gone now. No supply trucks could enter. No ambulances could leave. Bayhaven had become an island surrounded by black water and hurricane winds. Rain continued pouring sideways as Mason restarted the boat engine and guided everyone back toward the elementary school shelter. The current had become much stronger since they left. Entire pieces of rooftops drifted through intersections along with coolers, furniture, bicycles, and broken signs torn loose by the storm. In several neighborhoods, the water had risen another 2 feet in less than an hour. Ryan could feel the exhaustion settling deeper into his muscles every time the boat slammed against hidden debris beneath the surface. But every few minutes, another flashlight appeared in the darkness from some rooftop or attic window. More people waiting. More families trapped. More voices calling for help. When they finally returned to the school, dozens of survivors rushed toward the doors carrying blankets around their shoulders. News about the bridge collapse had already spread through the shelter. Fear moved across the crowded gymnasium faster than the storm itself. Mothers whispered nervously while staring at phones that no longer had signal. Elderly couples sat silently holding hands beneath emergency blankets. Several children cried from hunger after eating almost nothing for an entire day. Claire immediately brought Emma into one of the classrooms they had turned into a temporary medical station. The little girl's fever was getting worse. Claire searched desperately through boxes of medicine while rain pounded against the school windows hard enough to rattle the glass. "I only have enough children's fever medicine for maybe 3 more doses," she said quietly to Ryan. "After that, I do not know what we are going to do." Sophie sat beside her daughter brushing wet hair away from Emma's forehead while trying not to cry. Ryan looked around the classroom at shelves growing emptier by the hour. They were already running low on bottled water. The backup generators barely powered half the building. Flashlights flickered constantly as batteries weakened. Even the warm bread Eleanor baked through the night had almost disappeared after feeding hundreds of people. In another part of the shelter, Mason stood near the entrance staring at the flooded streets outside. "The water is still rising," he muttered. "If this keeps going, the school will not stay dry much longer." Tyler sat against the wall near an outlet strip filled with dead power banks and drained phones. He kept trying to reconnect his live stream using weak emergency signals bouncing between damaged towers, but the connection failed every few minutes. "People want updates," he said quietly. "Families out there are looking for relatives. But everything is dying." Ryan walked through the crowded gymnasium slowly, checking on survivors one group at a time. He passed a father using his own jacket as a blanket for his 2 sleeping sons. He passed Eleanor handing the last pieces of bread to a group of exhausted teenagers who had not eaten since the storm began. Near the far wall, Harold sat wrapped in blankets with Jacob asleep beside him. The old man reached out and grabbed Ryan's wrist gently as he passed. "You came for us," Harold whispered with tired eyes. "Nobody else did." Ryan nodded once, but the words stayed with him long after he walked away. Outside, the storm continued screaming through Bayhaven like it had no intention of ever ending. Every few minutes, another emergency call crackled through. Portable radios carried by volunteers. Trapped residents. Rising water. Missing children. Roof collapses. Medical emergencies. Too many calls. Not enough people. Ryan stepped into the empty hallway outside the gym and leaned against the wall for the first time all night. Rainwater dripped from his jacket onto the floor, while distant thunder shook the building around him. Claire appeared quietly beside him, holding an empty medical supply box against her chest. Neither of them spoke for several seconds. Finally, Ryan rubbed his face slowly and stared toward the dark windows overlooking the flooded town. His eyes looked red from exhaustion and rain. "I do not know how much longer we can keep doing this," he admitted softly. Before Claire could answer, a terrified voice suddenly echoed through the hallway from the gymnasium entrance. "There is another family trapped near the marina," someone shouted. "Their house is almost underwater." Ryan closed his eyes for one brief second. Then he grabbed his flashlight and walked back toward the storm. The marina district looked almost unrecognizable by the time Ryan and the volunteers reached it again. The storm surge had swallowed the entire waterfront. Fishing docks floated loose through the streets while neon restaurant signs flickered underwater like dying lanterns. Rain continued pouring across Bayhaven in endless gray sheets that blurred buildings into shadows. Somewhere beyond the flooded shoreline, emergency sirens still echoed weakly through the darkness, but nobody knew whether rescue teams were even capable of reaching the town anymore. The convoy moved slowly past overturned boats and shattered storefronts while Tyler tried once again to reconnect his live stream. Suddenly, his phone screen flashed with a weak signal for the first time in hours. Thousands of messages flooded in almost immediately. Missing family members. Offers of help. People across the country watching Bayhaven disappear in real time. Tyler turned the camera toward Ryan as floodwater splashed against the truck tires. "People are asking why you keep going back out there," he said quietly. Ryan kept his eyes on the flooded road ahead. "Because somebody is still waiting for us," he answered. The rescue call near the marina came from a family trapped inside a bait shop built on elevated wooden stilts beside the harbor. By the time they arrived, the water had already reached the second-floor windows. A father waved desperately using a flashlight while holding 2 children close beside him. The youngest looked barely 4 years old. Mason maneuvered the rescue boat carefully through floating debris while Claire prepared blankets and dry clothes in the back. The wind near the waterfront felt stronger than anywhere else in Bayhaven. Waves from the harbor crashed directly into flooded streets, sending icy water over the sides of the boat every few seconds. Ryan climbed onto the partially submerged staircase leading into the bait shop, while the structure creaked beneath him. Inside, the terrified family clung together beside shelves already collapsing into the flood. The father's hands shook so badly he almost dropped his flashlight. "I thought nobody was coming," he whispered as Ryan guided the children toward the boat. "I thought we were alone out here." Ryan looked at the frightened little boy wrapped in a rain jacket several sizes too large for him. "You are not alone," he said softly. The return trip to the shelter felt longer than before. Everyone was exhausted now. Mason's shoulders trembled from steering the boat against the current for nearly 18 straight hours. Claire could barely keep her eyes open while checking Emma's fever again beneath the flashlight glow. Tyler stared silently at the livestream comments scrolling across his cracked phone screen. People from Texas, Ohio, California, and New York were watching strangers risk their lives in a flooded town most of them had never heard of before that night. Some viewers began organizing donation drives online. Others offered to send generators, medical supplies, and rescue equipment if roads reopened. For the first time since the storm began, hope flickered somewhere beyond Bayhaven. But inside the shelter, conditions were getting worse by the hour. The gymnasium smelled of wet clothes, exhaustion, and fear. Children slept on cafeteria tables, while volunteers rationed bottled water 1 cup at a time. Eleanor sat near the entrance slicing the final loaves of bread into smaller and smaller pieces so everybody could eat something before morning. Harold shared scraps of turkey sandwich with Jacob while staring silently at the rain pounding the windows. Claire moved from family to family checking temperatures and treating fevers using supplies that were nearly gone. At one point, she opened a medical cabinet and simply stood there staring at the empty shelves. Ryan noticed tears filling her eyes before she quickly turned away. "There is no more insulin after tonight," she whispered. "And we are almost out of antibiotics, too." Tyler suddenly rushed across the gym, holding up his phone. "Ryan," he said breathlessly. "People saw the live stream. Supplies are coming." Several exhausted survivors looked up immediately. Tyler continued, speaking louder now, almost unable to believe it himself. "Truck drivers from neighboring counties are already trying to get through. Churches are organizing food donations. Volunteer rescue teams are heading this way." For the first time all night, a small wave of relief moved through the shelter. Some people even began clapping quietly through their exhaustion. Ryan looked around the crowded gymnasium at faces still pale from fear and cold. Maybe they were not forgotten after all. Then the lights flickered violently overhead. A deep grinding sound echoed beneath the school building. Mason slowly looked toward the flooded windows near the gym entrance. The water outside had reached the top of the first-floor doors. By dawn, nobody inside the shelter could remember how long they had been awake. Time inside Bayhaven no longer moved normally. It stretched beneath the endless sound of rain and emergency radios until every hour felt the same. The gymnasium lights flickered weakly from backup batteries while exhausted families slept sitting upright against walls and cafeteria tables. Outside, the floodwater had swallowed almost the entire first floor of the school. Ryan stood near the entrance watching dark waves slam against the building through the glass doors. Pieces of rooftops and broken docks drifted silently through the flooded parking lot like ghosts. Mason joined him carrying 2 cups of stale coffee heated over a camping stove. "Storm is moving slower now," he muttered. "But the water is still climbing." Ryan nodded without speaking. His eyes stayed fixed on the distant shoreline barely visible through the gray rain. Somewhere out there, people were still trapped. Somewhere, another family was waiting in darkness hoping rescue would arrive before the water did. Then Tyler's emergency radio crackled loudly across the shelter. A weak voice pushed through heavy static. 3 people trapped near St. Matthew Street 2nd floor, water rising fast. The signal disappeared for a moment before returning again. "Please, anybody." Ryan immediately grabbed his jacket. Claire looked up from beside Emma's cot with exhaustion written across her face. "You cannot keep doing this," she whispered. Ryan checked the fuel gauge on the lantern beside him. "Almost empty." "I know," he answered quietly. "But somebody out there is still waiting." Within minutes, the rescue boat was back in the floodwater. The storm had weakened slightly, but the flooding had become even more dangerous. Strong currents rushed between buildings with enough force to pull entire vehicles loose from submerged streets. Mason steered carefully while Tyler held the flashlight beam ahead through heavy rain. Every now and then another emergency flare burned somewhere far away in the darkness before vanishing behind the storm. St. Matthew Street sat near the industrial district where floodwater now moved like a river. Most of the houses there had already disappeared beneath the surge. Ryan spotted the trapped family almost immediately. A mother and father stood on the second-floor balcony of a narrow brick home, holding a little boy between them. Water crashed against the staircase below hard enough to shake the entire structure. "We are coming," Ryan shouted over the wind. Mason guided the boat closer while Ryan climbed onto the submerged railing to reach the family. The father handed down the little boy first, wrapping him tightly in a blanket before Ryan passed him safely into Claire's arms inside the boat. Then everything happened at once. A loud metallic crack echoed somewhere nearby. Tyler swung the flashlight toward the flooded intersection just in time to see a fallen utility pole drifting through the current directly toward them. "Ryan," he screamed. Mason tried to turn the boat away, but the current was too strong. The drifting pole slammed into the side of the rescue boat with a violent jolt that threw everyone sideways. Water rushed over the edge instantly. Claire grabbed the little boy before he slipped. Mason lost control of the motor as the boat spun hard against the current. Ryan reached toward the family still trapped on the balcony just as another surge of water smashed into the side of the boat. Then the rescue boat flipped. The freezing floodwater swallowed everything. Tyler surfaced coughing beneath pouring rain while debris rushed around him in darkness. Claire struggled to keep the little boy above water while Mason fought against the current trying to reach them. Flashlights disappeared beneath the surface one by one until only distant lightning illuminated the flood. "Ryan!" Mason shouted desperately into the storm. No answer came back. Tyler spun through the water, searching wildly with the flashlight he had managed to keep. All he saw were broken boards, waves, and darkness. Claire's voice trembled with panic. "Where is he?" Nobody answered because nobody knew. The current had already carried the overturned rescue boat halfway down the flooded street. Mason finally managed to drag Claire and the little boy toward a floating section of fence while Tyler kept searching the black water around them. "Ryan!" he screamed again, louder this time. But the storm swallowed his voice completely. Back at the shelter, survivors crowded silently around the windows as Mason's damaged boat drifted back into the flooded parking lot without Ryan aboard. Claire stepped out first, carrying the rescued child, while shaking uncontrollably from cold and exhaustion. Tyler climbed onto the school steps with tears mixing into rainwater on his face. Nobody inside the shelter needed to ask what happened. The look in their eyes said enough. Somewhere beyond the darkness of Bay Haven, Ryan Mercer had disappeared into the flood. Silence spread through the shelter in a way the storm never could. Even with rain hammering the roof and floodwater crashing against the school walls, the absence of Ryan Mercer felt louder than everything else combined. Nobody spoke much after the rescue boat returned without him. Claire sat wrapped in blankets near the medical station staring at the floor, while Emma slept beside her under layers of dry towels. Mason stood near the darkened windows, gripping the edge of a cafeteria table so tightly his knuckles turned pale. Tyler remained motionless beside the charging station, where dozens of dead phones and powerless radios sat useless in tangled piles. Every few minutes, another survivor quietly approached the volunteers, hoping somebody had heard new information. Nobody had. Outside, Hurricane Helena continued dragging itself across the Gulf Coast with slow, relentless fury. Bay Haven remained buried beneath black floodwater and darkness. Entire neighborhoods were gone now. The school gymnasium had become the last safe place for hundreds of exhausted people who no longer knew whether rescue teams could even reach them. Claire finally broke the silence sometime near 3 in the morning. "We should have stopped him," she whispered softly. Mason shook his head immediately. "You know, Ryan," he answered without looking away from the storm outside. "Nobody could stop him from going after trapped families." Claire lowered her eyes again. Rainwater still dripped from her hair onto the blanket wrapped around her shoulders. The rescued little boy slept nearby beside his parents, unaware of how close everything had come to ending differently. Tyler suddenly stood up and grabbed his phone again. The livestream signal had returned weekly for only a few seconds at a time, but thousands of people were still watching and waiting for updates from Bayhaven. He stared at the camera for several long moments before speaking quietly. "We lost Ryan tonight." The comments exploded instantly. Messages flooded the screen faster than Tyler could read them. Prayers, shock, gratitude. Strangers from all over the country writing the same thing over and over. "Tell his team not to stop." Tyler swallowed hard while reading the messages aloud to the shelter. Slowly, people began listening. Truck drivers from Alabama were trying to bring generators through side roads north of the collapsed bridge. Volunteer boat crews from Louisiana were organizing rescue convoys. Churches in Texas had started collecting blankets, bottled water, and medicine after clips from Tyler's livestream spread across social media overnight. Even in the middle of disaster, people who had never met Ryan Mercer were trying to help the town he refused to abandon. Then, just before dawn, Jacob suddenly lifted his head beside Harold's chair and began barking toward the gym entrance. At first, nobody paid attention. The storm had made every sound feel strange for hours. But Jacob kept barking louder and louder while pulling against Harold's trembling hands. Mason slowly turned toward the glass doors leading outside. Through the rain and darkness, a shape was moving across the flooded parking lot. One person, staggering slowly through waist-deep water. For a second, nobody inside the shelter moved at all. Then Tyler grabbed a flashlight and sprinted toward the doors. Claire followed immediately, her heart pounding so hard she could hear it over the storm. The figure stepped closer beneath the weak beam of light. Torn jacket, blood running down one shoulder, exhaustion written into every movement. And on his back, wrapped tightly beneath his weather coat, was a little girl no older than 8 years old clinging weakly around his neck. Ryan Mercer had returned. The entire shelter erupted at once. People cried openly. Some survivors covered their mouths in disbelief, while others rushed forward through the flooded entrance to help carry the little girl inside. Claire reached Ryan first, grabbing his arm before his legs finally gave out beneath him. "I found her trapped in an attic near Crescent Avenue," he whispered through ragged breaths. She was alone. The little girl barely opened her eyes as Claire carried her toward the medical room. Ryan leaned against the wall, completely soaked and shaking from cold, but alive. Tyler stood frozen for a second before lifting his phone again, with tears streaming down his face. His livestream connection flickered weakly back online, just long enough for thousands of viewers across America to hear the words nobody inside Bayhaven thought they would ever hear again. "He came back," Tyler whispered into the camera. Inside the shelter, survivors who had spent the entire night drowning in fear suddenly began clapping through tears while rain continued crashing against the school outside. For the first time since Hurricane Helena arrived, hope walked back through the doors with them. Morning arrived slowly over Bayhaven, hidden behind thick gray clouds and the lingering rain of Hurricane Helena. But for the first time in days, something had changed inside the shelter. People still looked exhausted. Children still slept beneath blankets spread across cafeteria floors. Floodwaters still surrounded the school in every direction. Yet the hopeless silence that had filled the building the night before was gone. Survivors whispered to each other again. Volunteers moved with new energy. Even the exhausted faces of parents holding hungry children carried a small trace of relief after watching Ryan Mercer walk back through those doors alive. Claire spent most of the morning treating Ryan's injured shoulder while he argued about returning outside before she finished wrapping the bandage. "You nearly drowned," she told him quietly while tightening the clean gauze. Ryan winced slightly, but kept staring toward the flooded windows. "There are still people out there," he answered. Claire looked at him for a long moment before finally shaking her head with tired disbelief. "You are impossible," she whispered. Nearby, Tyler sat beside the charging station, holding his phone toward the weak emergency signal still flickering across the screen. During the night, his live stream had spread far beyond the Gulf Coast. Millions of people had now watched clips of ordinary volunteers rescuing stranded families in Bayhaven, while official emergency crews struggled to reach the isolated town. News stations across the country replayed footage of flooded streets, exhausted survivors, and the moment Ryan returned carrying the little girl through the storm. Tyler scrolled through endless messages from strangers offering help. Former military rescue divers from Florida wanted to join the volunteer effort. Church groups in Tennessee were collecting diapers and medicine. Construction workers from Arkansas had already loaded chainsaws and generators onto trailers heading south. Ryan, Tyler said suddenly while staring at his phone in shock. People are actually coming. Outside the shelter, the storm had finally begun weakening. Rain still fell steadily, but the violent winds that tore apart Bayhaven for days were slowly fading into distant thunder. By late afternoon, the first rescue convoy appeared beyond the flooded highway north of town. The trucks could not cross the collapsed bridge, but local fishermen and volunteer boat crews had started ferrying supplies through dangerous backwater routes around the shoreline. Survivors rushed toward the school windows as small boats emerged through the flood carrying bottled water, fuel cans, blankets, medicine, batteries, baby formula, and portable generators. Some volunteers arriving in Bayhaven had driven across multiple states without sleeping after seeing Tyler's livestream online. One older truck driver stepped into the shelter carrying cases of bottled water through waist-deep floodwater. "Saw your story in Missouri," he said simply. "Could not stay home after that." More boats followed behind him all afternoon. Some carried nurses. Others brought emergency food supplies and fuel for generators. Several young volunteers from Louisiana unloaded rescue equipment while introducing themselves like they had known the Bayhaven team for years. Inside the shelter, people who had spent days trapped in fear suddenly began helping each other again with renewed purpose. Teenagers formed supply lines through the flooded hallways carrying food and dry clothes. Eleanor cried quietly while opening boxes filled with fresh bread donated by bakeries hundreds of miles away. Claire finally received antibiotics, fever medication, and insulin after rationing supplies for nearly 2 days straight. Emma's fever slowly began breaking by evening. Sophie hugged Claire so tightly she nearly lost her balance. Even Mason smiled for the first time since the storm began while helping unload a replacement rescue boat brought in by volunteer fishermen. As the sun briefly pushed through the storm clouds for the first time in days, weak golden lights spread across the floodwater surrounding Bayhaven. The town still looked devastated. Entire neighborhoods remained underwater. Boats drifted through streets where cars once parked. Telephone poles leaned at impossible angles beside shattered buildings. But everywhere people were moving now, helping, carrying supplies, rescuing strangers, refusing to abandon each other. Ryan stood outside the school entrance watching volunteers arrive one after another through the fading rain. Tyler stepped beside him, holding his phone toward the distant convoy still approaching through flooded roads. "You realize people across the country are calling Bayhaven the town that refused to give up," Tyler said quietly. Ryan looked out over the ruined streets where exhausted volunteers and survivors worked side by side beneath the clearing sky. Then he noticed children laughing softly while helping distribute blankets near the shelter doors. For the first time since Hurricane Helena made landfall, Bayhaven no longer felt like a town waiting to disappear. It felt like a town fighting to survive. Weeks after Hurricane Helena finally left the Gulf Coast, Bayhaven still looked like a town caught between ruin and rebirth. Mud covered entire streets where floodwater once rushed like rivers. Boats sat stranded in the middle of intersections. Storefronts remained shattered beneath faded signs coated in salt and debris. Every morning the sound of generators echoed through neighborhoods where electricity had not fully returned. But little by little, life began moving again. Volunteers from across the country continued arriving long after television crews disappeared. Church groups rebuilt damaged homes beside construction workers who had driven hundreds of miles simply because they saw strangers suffering and decided to help. Retired electricians restored power lines one block at a time, while local fishermen used their boats to deliver supplies into isolated neighborhoods still buried beneath standing water. Bayhaven was wounded, but it was alive. Ryan Mercer and his team never left. Every sunrise found them back in the streets wearing muddy boots and carrying tools through damaged neighborhoods. Mason helped clear fallen trees and debris from roads using old construction equipment donated by volunteers. Claire worked 12-hour days inside a temporary medical clinic built in the school gymnasium where the shelter once stood. Tyler continued live streaming every stage of the recovery effort, showing people across the country not just the destruction left behind by Hurricane Helena, but the rebuilding that followed it. Millions kept watching. Donations continued arriving from states Ryan had never even visited before. Eleanor reopened her tiny bakery less than a month after the storm using ovens powered by emergency generators. Every Friday evening, she still baked bread for free community dinners behind the old church downtown. Survivors who once huddled together inside the flooded school now sat side by side, sharing warm meals beneath strings of temporary lights hanging across rebuilt streets. Harold and Jacob became familiar faces around town again. Every morning, the old man walked slowly through neighborhoods, helping volunteers hand out bottled water and hot coffee. Sometimes he stopped near the marina and stared quietly at the empty water where entire sections of Bayhaven once stood before the storm. Then he would scratch Jacob behind the ears and keep walking. Sophie eventually found work helping organize supply deliveries for displaced families, while Emma returned to school inside temporary classrooms built from donated trailers. One afternoon, Ryan passed the playground near the rebuilt elementary school and stopped for a moment when he saw Emma laughing while chasing other children across fresh grass still growing through muddy soil. For the first time since the storm, the sound of children laughing no longer felt fragile. It felt normal again. Tyler's videos eventually spread far. Beyond social media, news programs called Bayhaven a symbol of resilience. Documentaries were made about ordinary people who drove into a disaster while everyone else fled from it. Ryan hated the attention every single time reporters tried calling him a hero. Heroes wear uniforms, he always answered. We were just neighbors helping neighbors. But the people of Bayhaven knew the truth was bigger than that. They remembered the freezing nights inside the shelter while floodwater climbed outside the walls. They remembered exhausted volunteers rescuing strangers in total darkness. They remembered Ryan Mercer disappearing into the flood and returning at dawn carrying a little girl through the rain. Years later, long after the streets were rebuilt and the scars of Hurricane Helena slowly faded from the coastline, people still talked about that storm in Bayhaven. Visitors often came searching for the places shown in Tyler's live streams or the garage where volunteers first gathered before driving into the hurricane. Many expected to hear stories about destruction and fear. And yes, there had been fear. There had been loss too. But survivors rarely spoke about the storm itself for very long. Instead, they talked about the volunteers who refused to abandon strangers. They talked about the bakery owner who fed hundreds of people using almost nothing. They talked about the exhausted nurse who treated survivors for days without rest. They talked about the truck drivers, fishermen, church groups, and ordinary families who crossed flooded roads to help people they had never met. Most of all, they talked about the night Bayhaven learned something stronger than fear. Because when the floodwaters rose and the darkness swallowed the town, ordinary people chose to walk straight into the storm for each other. And long after Hurricane Helena became history, that was the part nobody ever forgot.